So hello, my name is Shannon Mason Young, and welcome to Wisconsin Literacy Winter Conference Session, Explicit Vocabulary Instruction for Adults with Reading Difficulties, presented by Dr. Lauren Zepp. We want to give a big thank you to our sponsors for helping make this event possible. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit literacy coalition that unites over 80 member agencies across the state to strengthen the power of learning in every community. Through collaboration, professional development, health, digital and workforce literacy programs, and advocacy, we expand opportunities and build a more equitable, literate Wisconsin. We have a couple housekeeping announcements. This session is being recorded and we will post it on our website along with the slide deck of this presentation in about a week. Please mute yourself to help keep the noise down in our presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, put them in the chat. We're going to answer them at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, be sure to stay on after the end of this presentation. We'll have a 15-minute lightning solution session from Essential Education about what they have with their Practice Plus GED. And you can win a great prize, a chance to win a great prize. So moving on to our presentation. Dr. Lauren Zepp is an assistant professor of special education and coordinator of the Graduate Certificate in Dyslexia and Language-Based Learning Disabilities at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lauren Zepp.
Everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to see so many people here. And I really am loving reading where you're from and seeing the kinds of institutions we have represented. I'm going to switch to sharing my screen so that you can see. And we will also put a link in the chat so that you can access these slides if you wish to do so. You'll also see that there's a handout we're going to use to do some activities today so that you can actually practice applying some of these concepts right away. So I'm going to get started with some conversation around explicit vocabulary instruction and I'll tell you a little bit about myself and the work that I do and how I come to this particular moment in time. All right, so first up, we will go through our agenda. And as I mentioned, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to me. I've got some materials we're going to use for this session. You are welcome to utilize the slides. There are some embedded links to some resources at the end. And we will also make use of the handout that's provided. So whether you choose to type into your browser window to access those or click on the link, both ways work great. I will begin with some learning objectives for our session today. We'll talk a little bit just about why vocabulary is so important in the reading process. And then we're mostly going to spend our time focused on an instruction called SWIT. And SWIT actually stands for Selecting Words for Instruction from Text, but you can remember it as selecting words in text. And then we'll talk about 2 explicit vocabulary instructional routines that you can use with this strategy. And then we'll wrap up the session. So first, just a little bit about me. As Shannon mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of special education at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I'm also on the board of Wisconsin Reads, a nonprofit that advocates for science-based reading instruction across the state of Wisconsin. And I am a longtime special educator. This is my 16th year in education, and I spent 10 years teaching special education at Madison East High School in Madison, Wisconsin, before I went to get my doctorate. And before that, I was a teacher in Washington, D.C., working with students with disabilities. And my heart is really with those adolescent and young adult learners who are striving to make sense of what they read and be able to apply it for employment, for independent living, and of course, for returning to education in post-secondary programs. Here you can see a photo of me with some of the graduates of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater's LIFE program, which stands for Learning is for Everyone. And this is a program I work a lot with, which serves young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and having a complete college experience on campus, including helping our teacher candidates design and provide reading interventions for these students. So I just say all this to orient you, hopefully a little bit to my background, and to stress that while I'm in this position now in higher education, I'm a longtime teacher, and my heart is really in thinking about how we support the most vulnerable students and helping them to achieve their goals, and knowing that reading and writing is a part of that. So, with that being said, today our session will focus on defining the tiers of vocabulary that we are going to encounter in text, and using that to sort of help us think about what words will be best suited for instruction given a particular learner or group of learners. Then we'll talk about how we will select useful vocabulary from text for instruction. And finally, we will practice some instructional routines related to explicitly teaching these useful vocabulary words toward that goal of helping our students develop their language and reading skills. So first, just thinking about the conceptual framework that I'm going to talk about today. If you're working in a literacy space, you might have heard of something like the simple view of reading or Scarborough's reading rope. And these are frameworks that we use to talk about how reading develops over time. There's a somewhat newer model published a few years ago by Duke and Cartwright that I really like, because it takes an even more global view of the reading process and thinks about some pieces that aren't mentioned in other models. So this is called the active view of reading. And what I like to point out here is that reading is an interactive process between a person and the text that they're reading, and it requires a whole host of skills that we need to build and support as educators to eventually allow a person to engage in skilled reading. And that's often our outcome or our goal that we're looking for. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of the purple bridging processes, specifically building vocabulary knowledge. And this is such a powerful place to start, because you'll see that it's utilizing some skills that are required for word recognition and language comprehension. This is what I would consider to be a high leverage practice, meaning that it's really going to build students' skills in a variety of different domains that contribute to successful reading outcomes. So before we kind of get into the what of this and the why, let's talk about some just key terminology. What do I mean when I say vocabulary? Vocabulary are all the words that we understand and use when we're listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We can think about vocabulary in terms of whether it's receptive, something that we take in, meaning things that we understand when we listen or when we read, and then expressive, things that we can put out, things that we produce in speaking and writing. You can also think about vocabulary as sound-based or kind of through the air oral language skills. That's our listening and speaking. And then print-based, reading and writing. Most people have different skills in both their receptive and expressive vocabulary. Most people understand more words than they typically use in their speaking and writing, but they can recognize them when they're listening or reading. And most people also have a much larger oral language vocabulary, words that we know and utilize in listening and speaking than we do in reading and writing. It's also important to know that the vocabulary that we encounter in text tends to be different than our everyday vocabulary. And because of this, we have to think about vocabulary instruction a little bit differently, especially when we're working with folks who are primarily focused on interacting with text and building that reading comprehension piece of their skill set. Vocabulary knowledge is one of the most significant predictors of reading comprehension ability. And that receptive vocabulary, what we can take in and understand through listening and reading, is particularly critical for the reading comprehension process. Some research has indicated that vocabulary and background knowledge actually plays a bigger role in how much we understand of what we read than things like decoding abilities or even use of comprehension strategies. So what we know before we start reading a text, including the vocabulary and background knowledge necessary for comprehension, plays a very, very large role in whether we will understand what we read. With that in mind, we think about vocabulary instruction as something that's especially critical, but we also recognize that most vocabulary is learned indirectly. If you think about the majority of the words that you use every day, it's unlikely that someone explicitly taught them to you. We just acquire language over time. And that's true with young children. If you've ever been a parent of a toddler, you know there's this language explosion where they're acquiring new words all the time, and that continues throughout most of our life. However, when we're more likely to acquire through oral language and exposure is what we would consider to be that oral vocabulary. And that's going to differ from the vocabulary that we're more likely to encounter in texts. So we need a specific set of skills to be able to interact with text and build that vocabulary knowledge. And I like to think of this in two ways. One is what we call word learning strategies, which is where we're teaching our students ways that they can make sense of unfamiliar words when they encounter them in a text, teaching people to use a dictionary, morphemic analysis, using those meaningful word parts like prefixes, suffixes, and Latin roots to make sense of words, and context clues. The other way that we directly teach vocabulary is what's called specific word instruction. And this is where we're directly teaching the meaning of selected words, often from a text or a particular content area. We might pre-teach words before a reading activity to, again, expand a child's learner's vocabulary and improve their comprehension. And we also want to engage the learner in helping to select and use those new vocabulary words with repeated exposures provided, because we know that it takes at least 12 exposures to a new vocabulary word for a person to be able to retain it and use it effectively. So today we're going to focus on that specific word instruction piece of things, about how do we decide which words we're going to teach for specific word instruction, and then how do we directly teach those words in ways that are effective and are going to start providing some of those repeated exposures that we know learners need. So again, this instructional approach is called SWIT, and it's selecting words for instruction from text. The rationale behind this kind of approach is that by explicitly teaching words from texts, we're utilizing an evidence-based strategy to improve reading comprehension. This is a particularly useful approach because it's very, very flexible. We can utilize this approach with any text in any subject area or domain. And it also means that we can provide some really intentional scaffolding to support our learner where they're at in this moment in time, in growing both their vocabulary and their reading comprehension skills. I have provided this training, of course, for school teachers who are working with students in a K-12 setting. I've worked with actually our college faculty here at UW-Whitewater in general education in applying this strategy to their courses, because we know that many of our incoming undergraduate students struggle with reading comprehension, and we can support them across content areas by engaging in some of this vocabulary development. There are three tiers of vocabulary words. And what I mean when we're talking about these tiers of vocabulary is that the words that we utilize in our everyday language are, again, different than the words that we encounter in written text. Our tier one words are those everyday words that are typically acquired through conversation and exposure, and they usually don't require direct or explicit instruction. We also think of these as basic interpersonal communication skills. The majority of the words that you've heard me use today would fit into this category. They're just part of how a person converses with other people around them. I am using some, of course, domain-specific vocabulary here, but this is also probably most of the words that you've used in your day so far. Tier 2 words are considered to be high-frequency words in writing, but they're not as common in everyday speech. They're really important words for comprehension, and they're also useful in writing. And they usually require some targeted instruction. The other important thing to remember about tier 2 words is that they're going to have broad utility, so we can utilize them across multiple different subject areas. Tier 3 words are what we consider to be low frequency, highly specialized words that are specific to one content area or academic domain. We typically only learn and use these words in that specific subject area. So we call this cognitive academic language proficiency because it really is specific academic language and it fits within a particular domain of or subject area. You can also think of these words with the terms accessible, right? Tier 1 words are going to be accessible for most learners, including folks who are learning English and coming from a multilingual perspective. We probably know that one of the most effective ways for people to acquire a new language is by immersion, being involved in that language, getting that opportunity to practice conversation back and forth. And that's how we learn a lot of new vocabulary words. Those high frequency words that are more common in writing are considered valuable words. They're really, really useful, especially for reading and understanding texts and also for professional writing, but they're not going to be as common in our everyday speech. They also won't have that same level of accessibility where we can learn them without explicit instruction. And
Lauren,
then oh,
I'm sorry, there's
that's
a
okay.
question in the chat for, please give an example of tier 2 words, if you
I'm going
could.
to give some in just a moment.
I knew you would. Thank you.
Thank you. And then some tier 3 words, again, like are these essential words? We can't make sense of the content that we're learning if we don't know what these words mean. But they're going to be, again, specific to a particular content area. So I'm going to go through just a little bit more about each of the tiers, and then you're going to see some examples too. But those tier 1 accessible words, again, are those common high frequency words in our spoken language. For most people, we don't spend a lot of time explicitly teaching these words. Some learners might need that level of instruction, and that would be students who have very limited vocabulary knowledge. Older students who are learning English, the window for learning a new language closes at about age 7. It becomes much more difficult to acquire vocabulary through exposure alone after that age. So that's why we provide more explicit instruction. Or if you've tried to learn a new language, perhaps you have engaged in some explicit instruction to help you acquire the new vocabulary. And then students with language delays or disabilities, and that could include adults who are learning to read. Many adults did not receive a diagnosis of a learning disability in school, but would now likely qualify and be able to receive some services because our diagnostic procedures have changed. So I will share some examples of tier 1 words in a moment, but these are often concrete words that we are utilizing in our everyday life, and then function words, things like articles, the, in, a, on, that are going to be useful for grammar and syntax, as well as like concrete nouns, action words, things like that. Tier 2 words, again, are these valuable words that have broad general utility, and they're going to occur often in writing. So students are likely to encounter these across text in a variety of subject areas. But we want them to be words that we can describe or explain with a tier 1 word. My favorite example to give when I'm talking about this, because I have a 6-year-old whose favorite phrase to use is, "I'm so mad." And in trying to engage him in a little bit of vocabulary development and also trying to figure out what's the particular area of frustration for him, I might say, "Oh, you're feeling mad. Are you feeling frustrated or are you feeling angry?" Right? And I might give some other kind of more sophisticated synonyms for angry. I might say, "Are you feeling enraged or infuriated?" Right? And again, that's just adding that sophistication, but I can explain it with a tier 1 word, like you're feeling very mad if you're feeling enraged. So it has some conceptual grounding for him, but it's also helping to expand his oral language vocabulary. Tier 2 words often need to be explicitly taught. And what a tier 2 word is always determined in relation to both the text that we're looking at and the vocabulary knowledge of our students. Tier 2 words that I would select for a group of first graders are going to be different from those that I might select for middle school or high school students or even adult learners. The key thing here with a tier 2 word and thinking about this is that it's going to be in that zone of proximal development for our particular learner or learners. We want to select words that are going to be appropriately challenging without being too frustrating that it kind of turns us off to the activity. And then these tier 3 words, again, are those domain-specific vocabulary words. They're usually only going to apply to one subject area, but we need to know them if we're going to read and understand a text that comes from that subject area. These words almost always need to be explicitly taught, and we typically pre-teach them before engaging in a reading activity to scaffold that comprehension process, because most people who don't have knowledge of this subject area are unlikely to know those words before they start reading. So here's some examples of what this might look like across different subject areas. For example, in geometry, a tier 1 accessible word might be something like shape, or even specific shapes like square or triangle, right? And asking a student to identify those is something that we would consider to be pretty accessible. We wouldn't need to necessarily explain what is a shape. A tier 2 version would be something like triangular. This could be used to describe a shape in geometry class. It could also be used to describe the path of the transatlantic slave trade in antebellum, United States. It could also be used to describe other kinds of geographical concepts or trade, or all kinds of different processes and procedures could be described as triangular. And then that essential word would be something like isosceles. Isosceles triangles, it's only going to appear in geometry. Do we need to know what that is if we are learning about geometry? Yes, absolutely. But it's not going to have the same kind of broader utility as something like triangular, which might apply to other content areas. Another great example, thinking about anatomy and physiology, blood would be a tier 1 accessible word. Circulatory or circulation might be that tier 2 valuable word. I could be talking about how blood moves through the body. I could also be talking about how newspapers are distributed during the progressive era, the 1920s, right? So it could be used in different subject areas. And that tier 3 essential word would be something like aorta, a specific part of the heart. And that term is not going to be found in any other content area, but we do need to know it if we're learning about how blood moves through the body. So I've got other examples here with English language arts. Something like conversation or talking would be a tier 1 accessible word. Something like dialogue might be that tier 2 or valuable word that, again, might show up in other content areas. And denouement might be that tier 3 essential word that really only applies to a particular literary convention. All right, I do see there is something in the chat. Yep, I'm going to put this copy of the slides here. You can access those from that link. And then my final example, in a social studies or history class, we might be talking about a tier 1 accessible word like freedom, a tier 2 valuable word like abolition, and a tier 3 word like management, right? So again, specific domain vocabulary. Tier 2 words are going to be more common in writing than in our everyday speech, but very useful across multiple content areas. And then those tier 1 words, often words that are familiar already, part of our oral language, typically not requiring a lot of instruction. When we're talking about designing and selecting words that we want to teach, of course, we want to emphasize those tier 3 essential words, but we want to do it quickly. These are important words to make sense of a particular reading or subject matter, but they're not going to have the same value across content areas, so we don't want to spend as much time on them. When we're thinking about words that we want to spend time teaching and really go in depth on, it tends to be these tier 2 valuable words for most of our learners. Most people are not going to need a ton of instruction on those tier 1 accessible words, and the tier 3 ones just don't have enough instructional potential to kind of warrant taking a lot of time to deliver instruction in those areas. So tier 2 valuable words give us what I would consider to be kind of the most instructional bang for our buck. All right, how do we figure out what these tier 2 valuable words are? First, I want you to always remember that the learner and the text that you're using is what you use to determine this. So there isn't like a clear cut right and wrong answer each time. It might vary depending on the vocabulary, knowledge, and skill of the person that you're working with or the group of learners that you're supporting and the text that you're choosing to use. What we're looking for, though, are words that are going to have, again, that broad utility. They're more common in writing than in oral language, and they're going to be useful across content areas. But we also want words that our students can use to describe their experiences. If you remember back a few minutes ago, I mentioned that it takes at least 12 exposures for a person to retain a new vocabulary word. And part of that exposure also needs to be using the new vocabulary word. We know that when people immediately start meaningfully using a new vocabulary word, they are much more likely to retain it long term and be able to utilize it again in the future. So we want to select words for instruction that our student or learner can use to describe their experiences, because that's going to, again, allow them to engage in more opportunities for exposure and practice. We also want words that are going to make sense with some kind of a conceptual anchor. The general concept should be something that's familiar to the student, but the tier 2 or valuable word is going to give some greater sophistication or nuance to it. For this reason, I sometimes call tier 2 words sophisticated synonyms. They're just a little bit more advanced, but I can always think of a synonym that comes from that tier 1 accessible kind of range. And finally, we want words, again, that are going to have high instructional potential. These multidimensional words that are going to appear across a variety of content areas, because we want to make sure that every instructional minute we have is really counting for our students. Oops. All right, we're going to get into some application next, practicing with selecting some words for instruction from text. So if you utilize the link that I provided to the handout, you'll first see a Newsella article called Why Some Flowers Greet Us Each Spring. A great reminder at this time of year for us in Wisconsin that spring is coming. And one of the signs for many people of spring is starting to see some little green buds start popping up out of the dirt. So I'm going to ask you to open up that document. Is anybody having a hard time getting the materials? All right. So I'll pause and allow you to take a moment to just generally start reading through this article. It's written for about a fourth grade audience in terms of the vocabulary sophistication. And as you read, I want you to look for words that you think might fit in that tier 2 valuable category and some words that fit in that tier 3 essential category. Remember, there isn't a right or a wrong answer necessarily. What we're looking for is what would make sense as something with a lot of instructional potential that's more common in writing than it is in oral language. And that's going to describe those tier 2 words. And then those tier 3 words are words that are really specific to a particular content area, in this case, plants and plant growth. And that aren't going to have a lot of use in other areas, but that we really need to know to make sense of what we're reading. All right, I'm going to pause and let you go ahead and read and try to find some of those words. If you've just joined us, we are reading Why Some Flowers Greet Us Each Spring and looking to see if we can identify some words that we might choose to teach for vocabulary instruction.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on my phone and I don't have access to my tablet right now, so I couldn't get to the article. So when I was trying to find it, I left and I came back. So I'll just wait
Oh,
for the
okay.
rest of the presentation.
There's no groups. We're going to share out as a whole in about 2 minutes. We'll take about 1 more minute before we start sharing. If you don't make it to the end of the article, that's okay. You still have had some, hopefully, practice identifying some of these words. All right, coming back together, just going to ask folks to share, and we'll start with trying to identify some of those tier 2 valuable words. So if you'd like to, you're welcome to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute and share them verbally, you can. I'll just take a few folks who want to share some of those ideas. Monocarpic does indeed stand out as a tier 3 word. I see evolved, anew, sprout, and fade. Showers could be tier 2. Any others? Yeah, here we go. Showers, poke, scarce, gambling, cautious, cells, tropical. I love those. Dormant, blossom, excellent. I see botanical here. Some great tier 3 options too, like annuals, biennials, perennials, DNA, clusters, evolved, sprout, familiar, excellent. Yes, these are all great ideas. We've got a lot of good tier 2 words here. And then there are also some tier 3 words that people are taking note of, things like annuals and the types of flowers like foxgloves, right? Or monocarpic, perennials. These are more of those tier 3 kind of words. All right, so here's the list that I came up with. My tier 2 words, valuable ones, are available on the left. I included the words evolved, anew, sprout, wither, clusters, scarce, resources, species, cautious, devote, and dormant. And then I included as tier 3 words, annuals, biennials, perennials, botanical, and monocarpic. Now, if you had other words on your list, that's okay. It may be because you're envisioning a different student than I have in my mind when I read this article, right? What we determine for what counts as a tier 2 or tier 3 word is always in relation to our learners. If you're working with more students who are perhaps learning English, or really, building some initial reading skills, they may have more words in their tier 2 bank that might fall under a tier 1 kind of umbrella for another learner. It's always in relation to the student that we're thinking about. I wanted to call your attention to 3 words that I've got in the tier 3 group: annuals, biennials, and perennials. These are nouns that describe specific kinds of flowers with differing life cycles, but we could also use them as adjectives, right? You could say annual or biennial or perennial. And in those cases, I would consider those to be more tier 2 words, but because they're referring to a specific kind of plant, that's why I put them in that tier 3 bucket. All right, very good. So now that we've selected some of these words, now we can think about what would be the most effective ways to teach them. And selecting words for instruction from text recommends 3 main approaches to specific word instruction. First is what we call powerful or robust vocabulary instruction, which is a direct instructional approach. Second is a brief explanation, which is also a direct approach where we're teaching a specific word. And third is what we call inferring meaning from context or through structural and morphemic analysis. That again is going to be utilizing context clues or again, like those meaningful word parts like prefixes, suffixes, and Latin roots to make sense of what a word might mean. And students do need explicit instruction in how to do that, but it's considered broadly to be an indirect instructional approach because the hope is that after teaching students the strategy, they're able to apply it more independently. I mentioned to Shannon earlier that I'm actually presenting for the Reading League Wisconsin on some of those inferencing strategies for word meanings in March, and you would be welcome to watch that webinar or attend the live session if you wish, and she'll share out the link to that with the network in just hopefully a few days. So our purpose today is mainly to focus on these direct routines. So what we're going to talk about is that powerful or robust instruction and brief explanation. And we'll save inferring meaning from context and morphemic analysis for another day. A brief explanation is exactly what it sounds like. It's a quick explanation of this unfamiliar word. And we often do this when we're reading out loud with students or when we're working together to read a text. For example, a student might encounter the word non-living in a passage called It's the Circle of Life, which always makes me think of The Lion King. And the student might read a sentence like, an ecosystem is the network of all the living and non-living things in an area. The teacher who wants to model identifying this potentially unfamiliar word might say something like, non-living might sound like it means the same as dead, but it doesn't. Non-living means things that were never alive, such as rocks or water. What's another example of a non-living thing? And hopefully a student would come up with something like sand. And we would say, yes, sand is non-living because it was never alive. So you can see that we're giving a very brief, quick explanation, and then a couple of examples to help the person make sense of what this unfamiliar word might mean. This strategy works really well because we can often do it kind of on the fly. So we don't have to pre-plan. A student might encounter a challenging word or something that they're not sure about, ask for some clarification, and we can typically provide that brief explanation in that moment, give a couple quick examples, and then move on. And we've provided them with one exposure to this word, potentially a few others if we're repeating it a couple of times, and some examples, but we don't want to spend a lot of instructional time on this particular word or approach. We want it to go quickly. That's why it's called a brief explanation. We can also pre-plan this as part of our instruction by, again, identifying words we think students might struggle with as they read, and then deciding to pre-teach them with a brief explanation before reading. I like to use the brief explanation approach for those kind of in the moment questions that students might ask for clarification. And I also like to pre-plan them for those tier 3 words where I know I need to explain what this is to students, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because it doesn't have that broader instructional potential to be useful across content areas. The other instructional approach that we'll discuss today is called powerful or robust vocabulary instruction. This is a 3-step process where we first capture the meaning of the word in the context it's used in this particular text. Then we contextualize it using examples that come from the text, but then outside examples also to help foster generalization and help it make sense for the person. And we end with providing a student-friendly definition, explaining the word in some everyday language. Again, capturing is talking about how the word is used in the particular text. We want to explain the word, but not really define it. That's not our goal here. We want to talk about how it's used in this particular text that we're reading. And we oftentimes will also ask students to repeat the word for proper pronunciation here. Contextualize means, again, giving some examples using what's provided in the text already, and then explaining the word with other examples from outside of the text that would be familiar to the learner and make sense to them. So this is where knowing our learner well is going to help us be able to plan this instruction in ways that are really meaningful. And then we finish it up with our student-friendly definition. We want to explain the word using everyday language. Often this is a condensed version of our explanation because we want it to be short and easily repeatable. And we're going to use tier 1 accessible vocabulary here. A student-friendly definition is different from a dictionary definition, and you likely know that using the dictionary can be challenging for someone who's still growing in their vocabulary development because dictionary definitions often include other unfamiliar words. So we want to use a student-friendly definition that only uses familiar, easy to understand vocabulary. And we want the person to be able to quickly and easily repeat that definition so that, again, they're using it and engaging in those multiple meaningful exposures that we know lead to long-term retention. So here's an example of what this looks like. On the right-hand side, you can see an image of a Black man sitting in a barber chair. This comes from the picture book Crown, An Ode to the Fresh Cut, which is a book that I love utilizing for powerful and robust vocabulary instruction. And when I say this, I mean with anybody because it includes such rich adjectives and descriptions and really beautiful illustrations. So it's a great book to use with a variety of different people and age groups. It's something that I actually utilize with my adolescent and young adult readers too, with lots of success. So the page on the right from the picture book actually has some text on it, which I'll read now, and then I'll show you how I would teach a word from this section with this strategy. The picture says, "Dude to the right of you looks majestic. There are thousands of black angels waiting to guide and protect him as soon as he steps foot out that door. That's how important he looks." The whole book is about going to the barbershop, getting a fresh cut, and really feeling good about yourself and powerful. So again, you can see some of this rich imagery and use of more advanced adjectives, which would be considered to be tier 2 vocabulary words. Something like majestic is more likely to occur in writing than in our everyday oral language. And understanding it can be connected to that conceptual understanding, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a second. So first, I want to capture how this word is used in this particular text. So here I'm drawing the student's attention to the picture, and I'm saying, in the picture, the man next to him has gotten a haircut that looks majestic. Due to his majestic haircut, he looks important. He looks majestic. Therefore, there are thousands of angels waiting for him when he walks out the door. Now I'm going to contextualize it. I'm going to give some other examples so that students can help make sense of this word across multiple contexts. When something is majestic, it's something so beautiful, it's almost magical. A bald eagle soaring through the air is majestic. A waterfall shimmering in the sun is majestic and grand. A horse's hair blowing in the wind while it's running is majestic, just like the man's hair. And then I end it with my student-friendly definition. Majestic means something that is so beautiful, it's almost magical. A short, quick explanation that ends it, and you can see that it's using mostly tier 1 familiar language, something that would be part of a person's everyday conversation. So there's no other unfamiliar words shown here. You'll also notice that I've underlined the target word majestic each time. I do this when I pre-plan my script because I also want to see how many new exposures am I giving to the learner, and that repetition, again, is going to be really helpful for them to hear the correct pronunciation and then be able to utilize it and think about it in these meaningful ways. So maybe they won't remember the student-friendly definition in its entirety, but they'll remember, oh, I know she talked about what it looks like when a horse is like running across a field with its beautiful hair blowing out behind it. Oh yes, now I can kind of connect to what this idea of majestic might be. All right, we're going to practice applying these two instructional approaches as we come close to the end of our session today. I have selected 2 words that I'm going to model for you from the Newsella article. I chose evolved, which I'm going to teach with a powerful or robust instructional approach, and anew, which I'm going to teach with a brief explanation. My brief explanation for anew is shown on the left-hand side. Anew means happening again. And I might ask the student to repeat that. What does anew mean? Happening again. What's a word that means happening again? Anew, right? Again, building in a few more exposures. You could, again, reframe that as something like, we know spring is something that happens anew, right? It's something that's expected and we know it's going to happen again each year. Then with my word evolved on the right, you can see some powerful and robust vocabulary instruction. First, I capture how it's used in the text. The article tells us that some plants die after one season, but other plants have evolved to come back year after year. Evolved means that the plants have changed over time to live longer. Now I'm going to contextualize, give some other examples. Human beings evolved from other forms of primates like chimpanzees. Horses have evolved to become bigger over time. A student's writing evolved as they learned more about writing stories. And then I end with my student-friendly definition. Evolved means something that changes over time. All right, you're going to practice now. So first, what we're going to do is decide from the vocabulary words we selected, how would you choose to teach these? Again, keeping in mind that we want to save powerful and robust vocabulary instruction for those really high utility tier 2 words. And we often use brief explanation for more tier 3 words, but there is a lot of flexibility here. So consider what words have the most instructional potential, which words have the highest utility, and which words could be quickly and easily explained. And you'll see this in your handout if you want to mark on that, or if you just want to be thinking about where you would group the words. We'll take about 1 minute, and then I'll show you how I would group these.
There's a question in the chat from someone who's asking if they can specifically request a SWIT be included in a PRP.
I think you're referring to a personalized reading plan
I'm guessing, yeah.
Yeah, as required under Act 20 legislation in Wisconsin. You certainly could request SWIT or specific word instruction as part of a PRP. It would really depend on the needs of the particular learner. Oftentimes with a PRP, what the focus is more on that decoding level of instruction because it is really in the K3 grade band where decoding is really tends to be the emphasis. But vocabulary instruction is powerful for students of any age. And hopefully, as you saw with the picture book example from Crown that I shared, this is something we can do as an oral language activity, even with children who aren't yet reading. And they still can really benefit because it's easier to read and decode a word once it's already part of our oral vocabulary. So I do think it's a great instructional strategy to include as part of personalized reading plans and to advocate for across content areas. It's a great question. All right, I'm going to share out some ideas here. So this is how I grouped these words. I chose to put sprout as a powerful or robust vocabulary instruction word because it's got some instructional potential. I could use that in some other content areas. Annuals, biennials, foxglove, and perennials, I put into a brief explanation because they're tier 3 words. I want to really just get through them quickly so that we can move on to other things. Clusters I put there too, and species because I think they lend themselves to easily being explained very quickly. But then other words that I chose to spend more time on instructionally are going to be words like sprout, scarce, resources, and cautious. These are words that learners are likely to see again in print, especially things like scarce, resources, and cautious. And so providing them with some extra opportunities to engage with that word is going to be beneficial long term. They're also words that they might want to utilize in their own writing. And so this is going to be worth our instructional time. So as I showed you with the words anew and evolved, now I'm going to ask you to do a brief explanation for the word clusters and to try to brainstorm how you might teach resources using that powerful or robust vocabulary instruction approach. You can find the word resources in 2 places on the second page of the Newsella article. So if you're looking for it, that's the place where you want to find it. And again, thinking about how do I capture this, how it's used here, and then how could I explain resources with some examples that might be relevant for a person's daily life. So take a moment, think about those. We'll share out a few quick ideas, and then we'll get to wrapping up our session. All right, just in the interest of time, does anybody have a suggestion for how they might teach clusters using a brief explanation? You can unmute or throw it in the chat. Cluster, a group of things that's close together. And I got an example here, small group, like a cluster of grapes. Excellent, perfectly done, right? Exactly how I would do it. It's a group of things close together. And you could give an example like a cluster of grapes, or my students tell me that nerds clusters are very popular candy. How about for resources? Specifically, did anyone come up with either an example they might use that would be relevant for a learner's life, or a brief student-friendly definition? This one's a little bit trickier. And you might think to yourself too, resources seems more like a tier 1 word. I think that's because we are accustomed to using it so much. So yeah, things to help you would be a great way to define that word simply and easily for students. Here's what I said for clusters. I said groups of things close together. For resources, I captured it in the text saying annuals. The text tells us that annuals put all their resources into making seeds, which is why they only live for 1 year. And then you can get some real life scenarios here, right? Wisconsin versus Arizona, as far as water resources go, a great way to talk about that. Framing resources as tools that we use to help us. If I'm speaking with someone who has a job, I might talk about the resources or tools that they utilize in their workplace. I can also give examples like resources that plants use are things like water, sunlight, and air. Cars use resources like electricity or gas. Valentine's cards, because I almost always have this session around Valentine's Day, use paper, markers, glitter, and glue as resources. Resources are something that we use or need. They're tools to help us or to provide what we need, right? And so again, just finishing off with that simple, easy to understand definition. All right, for continued learning, I've got some great resources linked here for you. There's 2 free self-paced modules focused on vocabulary instruction if it's something you want to learn more about. And there's also an article here. It's specific to adolescents, but I think it really lends itself well to working with young adults as well. So if that's a population that you serve, I do recommend this article. And if you want to learn more about robust vocabulary instruction and how to bring words to life, this great book by Beck, McGowan, and Kukin is really wonderful, and you can find it from any bookseller. It's pretty affordable too. I also will just put in a plug for my own work. UW-Whitewater has a graduate certificate in dyslexia and language-based learning disabilities. It's 15 credits. You do not need to be licensed as a teacher in order to complete this certificate. It's fully asynchronous and online with courses taught by our award-winning faculty, and we achieved accreditation status through the International Dyslexia Association last year. So if you're interested in becoming certified as a structured literacy teacher or just growing in your practice, we've got great courses that focus on some of this content, but can go much more in depth than we can in a 1-hour session. All right, so in this session, we talked about the tiers of vocabulary and how to identify those in texts for vocabulary instruction. And then we also went through 2 instructional routines to help us explicitly teach words to support our students' language and reading comprehension. And I would just like to say thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you today and share some of these resources. I truly hope that they were helpful. And if there's ever anything that I can do to help you support literacy work in your community, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much for your very active participation too. I really appreciate it.
And don't go away because we have a lightning solutions session coming up. So just stay with us, where you're going to hear about a really wonderful, wonderful program from Rich Palmer at Essential Ed and a chance to win a really great prize. But Lauren, thank you. Thank you so much. This was fabulous.
Yes, thank you. And we echo all of the comments that are currently in the chat. So thank you for your time in presenting your expertise and for the great resources that you have shared with us. Thank you all for attending Explicit Vocabulary Instruction for Adults with Reading Difficulties. Our next session is going to be new research, how adult education can help learners prepare for today workforce, and begins at 11:15. Marcia is putting the link to our agenda chat. You can find the registration information if you haven't already in that link. And we would just like to ask you to please complete the survey when you leave the Zoom session. If you leave it now, it will pop up, or after the lightning session. But again, we just really want to thank you, Dr. Zepp, for this great session. I have learned a great deal, and I'm going to use sophisticated synonyms at some point during my day today. But thank you very much, and I'm going to pass it along to Marcia now, and thank you again.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.